I read The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson for the Summer of Cosmere project that I'm doing, where I read every Cosmere story in the order that they were published. And so this one is coming after stories like Warbreaker, the Stormlight Archive, the Alloy of Law, the Mistborn trilogy, and Elantris. And this story takes place on the same world as Elantris and has a similar magic system to it. Although it doesn't include any of the characters or kingdoms or locations as the Elantris story, it might be somewhere in the same timeline roughly, but it's not progressing that story. And this is the largest, most substantial short story that we've gotten so far in the Cosmere. The other short story about Elantris was just kind of like a brief, almost like cut scene from the book, it felt like. Whereas this has like a distinct kind of character who is totally associated with this story and could be read in isolation and I think completely understood and appreciated without all of the context of the Cosmere. But it does give us a lot of interesting information about things that are possible in the universe and kind of plays with the ideas and themes that we've already been examining throughout this reading project. I think this story won a Hugo, if I'm remembering right. And I find this story to be the most postmodern of all of the stuff that we've gotten through so far in the Cosmere. And while Sanderson enjoys playing around with genre tropes and storytelling ideas and kind of assuming that, we as the readers are familiar with genre ideas, and then therefore he can use that to kind of do twists and surprises that we would have an expectation, oh, I know what will happen next because I've read a story like this, and then the exact opposite happens. That's kind of messing with genre. That's what I mean. I think this story goes a step further, though, and in a way is a story about storytelling itself, about a person who is an artist who needs to create a character, and that the primary conflict in this story is about contending with art instead of the kind of story where you have a protagonist and an antagonist, or even a protagonist who is trapped in a scenario. I mean, I think at the most surface level, you could kind of look at it as a prison escape story. But I think the real conflict and the emotional core of the story has to do with contending with art and trying to produce something that is authentic and steps up to the challenge of creating a masterpiece. And that's a kind of conflict that steps outside of the norms of storytelling before the postmodern period, where we have conflicts that are kind of a protagonist versus an antagonist, like person versus person style conflict, or an interior conflict where it's a person versus themselves, or the kind of conflict where it's a person versus their environment, like To Build a Fire by Jack London or something like that. Or even conflicts where it's like a person versus God, like, the story of Job or Moses or something like that, where there's this cosmic level antagonism that's happening, but it's all within the confines of the story itself. Postmodern stories examine a relationship between the character and the way in which they exist in a world context, that they're somehow like trapped in a story, or how language is fundamentally manipulating their reality. And so you look at something like Kafka, where someone just suddenly transforms into a cockroach, and then they have to contend with the absurdity and randomness of the world. Or like a Murakami story, where you're just suddenly breaching the walls of reality and stepping into a dreamlike place accidentally, and you just have no control over the ways in which reality kind of melts from one state to another. I think that's a reaction that manifests after our culture kind of shifts to a more materialist point of view on the universe, where the idea that like everything is random, that no one is really in control of anything out there in the universe, there is no God, and that therefore everything has no meaning and it's all random and absurd. Once we put ourselves as people experiencing the world in that context, it creates a new level of antagonism that's possible, where characters in a story can encounter the fact that they exist in a story and have to contend with that. And while Sanderson has played with the idea of God being dead in the Cosmere, and that's actually a really central problem in most of his stories, I've argued that he doesn't construct a universe that has random and absurd, meaningless materialism embedded in it. Instead, there are hard, discoverable limits about aesthetic truth that point to things like, the way that we can discover electromagnetism or gravity here in our world. Characters are able to discover hard limits of good and evil in the Cosmere in the same kind of way. There's a moral realism to that world. And I think this is further explored in The Emperor's Soul in terms of aesthetics. And so I would claim, I guess, that there is no kind of good or bad art in reality. That you're just talking about people's opinions when you're getting into successful art that is either good or bad. But this story is about discovering the limits of what is possible when creating a character, and that some things will create success while other things lead to failure. And it's those hard limits in the story that I think point to an idea on a meta level, on this kind of postmodern level that I'm talking about, that the Cosmere has a realism to it about aesthetic quality, that there's good art and that there's bad art, and that that's not purely up to your personal tastes and preferences, but that there's a conforming to an aesthetic reality that produces high quality art. And this is directly related to in the Elantra story, where I talked about the distance between the signifier and the signified in the language, the way in which the language and the land itself were directly tied to each other, and the failure of the language to fully cohere to the thing that it was signifying was what was causing the dysfunction in the magic. And once those signifier and signified had become completely aligned, that was when magic was able to be properly channeled. And so there was any number of ways to get it wrong, is what I'm saying, but there's only one way to get it right. Or it has to include these particular elements in order to be viable. And so that's an idea that says that language is not totally random and just made up of sounds and words that signify nothing at all. And then we apply meaning to it like post hoc and say, well, this means that and that means this. And that's what this sentence means to me. And maybe it means something else to you, but that's up to you. And everything is relative, and there is no bedrock of meaning to language. In the Cosmere, there is a bedrock to the Aeonic language, and it is directly tied to the land itself. And once the language is correctly tied to the land itself, to something concrete, to something real that can't be easily altered, then when you change things about the language, it changes reality around you. And that's similar to what's going in the story with Shai, where she's a forger and she has this ability to use language to create these seals that rewrite the history of objects and people that they are applied to, and then transform those things. Kind of like what happens in the Stormlight Archive world with soulcasters, right? Where Yasna is able to take a boulder and transform it into smoke. It seems like Shai is able to manipulate some element of the objects around her and transform them into other versions of themselves. But she's not able to just change anything into anything else with no boundaries on it. That would be more in touch with the kind of meaningless relativism that I'm talking about. The fact that there are hard limits to what she's able to achieve using language ties it to that process of signification that was so important in the Elantris story. So she can't just, turn a cup of water into a fireball or something like that. It has to be tied to the history of the object. So, for example, in the story, she's imprisoned in this room and given a table as a workshop. And then she inscribes the table in such a way that she changes its history after she learns about it. And so the table was a gift to the empire that is imprisoning her. And the emperor didn't like the person who gave it to him very much. And so he didn't value the gift and put it in storage, and it was neglected, and it became a little bit wobbly and scuffed up and bumpy and uneven, right? And so she just changes the history to be that, it was more valued and it was instead taken care of and polished and cared for to the point where she comes, to possess it. And now the table is a nice, flat work surface that's stable and serves the needs that she has as a creator, as an artist. And so that slight change in a plausible direction, something that could have happened in the story of the table, if you will, transforms the table. But it has to be within these confines of plausibility. And she's able to do the same kind of thing to a person. And so she has these magical seals that she has written for her own personal history, where she could transform herself into a different kind of person who is, a dangerous warrior or a brilliant scholar or a completely different kind of person who never learned about her magical abilities at all and can kind of drop out of her cultural milieu altogether and become something totally different. But only because it takes into account all of the variations of what would have been possible. This also reminds me of, like, in Mistborn, we have the 11th metal and the gold metal burnings where you get to see, your past self in some kind of alternate version or the past self of other people. It doesn't seem to me like the Cosmere has room for alternate realities or a kind of multiverse situation, but it does seem to have room for the idea of variation within a certain mode. And so in the Cosmere, successful aesthetic expression has to do with plausibility. It has to do with a kind of coherence to what you are signifying, like a realism to it. And I think you could look at like in the story of Warbreaker, there was a kind of judging that Lightsong did of different artistic expressions, like paintings and poems and things like that. And there was a painting in that story that was what we would consider like a postmodern abstract style painting that takes one hue of color, or I guess one color, and explores the different hues of it. And so the whole painting was red, but somehow in the use of different hues throughout it, it expressed a particular scene from a war, and that's what the painting was named after. And Lightsong was able to see the depiction of the war before he knew the title of the piece. But all of his priests and attendants just saw like random swaths of color swirled all over the place, like a Jackson Pollock style painting or something like that. And so there's reactions to that kind of art in the, in our world, the real world, or whatever you want to call it, that are like, well, that's not really art because it's not depicting anything. Like anybody could do that. A baby could make a painting like that. And therefore it's meaningless and it's not good art, right? Because it's not trying to cohere to the signification of anything. It's just randomness. But what made it supernaturally significant in the story of Lightsong was that it helped to presage the oncoming war that he had come back from the dead in order to stop. So it did actually signify something and had a successful supernatural connection to Lightsong's perceptions. And that's what made it good art, in the Cosmere, if you will. It coheres to this aesthetic realism that I'm talking about. And so in this story about being an artist and successfully creating a character, the thing that Shai needs to do is this emperor was killed in an assassination attempt. Well, I guess it's not an attempt. They assassinated him and he died. And they were able to bring his body back using this similar kind of magical inscription technique, but they weren't able to bring back his mind or consciousness or spirit, whatever you want to call it. And, the story is called The Emperor's Soul. So I guess we're talking about his soul. And so he's just kind of like in a vegetative state where he can be awake, but he's not conscious in any kind of sense. He doesn't have a history. So he's kind of like a blank human. And I think they bring back his body in the same kind of way that, like Miles' 100 Lives in the Alloy of Law that we just read was able to take a bullet to the head and just instantly heal from that and come back with no problem. That there's some way that there's a mechanism in the Cosmere that allows you to realign your body in some way and come back from otherwise fatal injuries. And we've seen a little bit of that, when you think of like Feruchemy with Sazed, where his body kind of transforms in, like the Incredible Hulk or something when he was gaining fantastic strength. Or he could use that same ability to heal his body from injuries, practically instantaneously and kind of skip over the healing process. Something similar was going on here with the Emperor, but it didn't successfully restore his interiority. And so what Shai has to do as an artist and creator is recreate his personality. And you could kind of step back from that and see a way in which Brandon Sanderson is telling a story about what it is like to be Brandon Sanderson, the storyteller, right? He has to plausibly create personalities for us to read in his stories that don't strain our ability to believe in them too much, right? That it doesn't throw us out of the immersive experience of being in a story to believe that a character would do this or that given their history and personality and on and on. And so Shai's challenge is both to escape her imprisonment, but also this personal challenge that she takes on because of her pride of successfully creating a masterpiece level work of art where she's able to craft the soul of a complete stranger to her. And I think there's something in the story also about leadership and the kind of people that we've been seeing throughout the Cosmere who are in charge of large nations and groups of people, and like what if you had the ability to create the leader of your country, what kind of person would you want in that role? Like, Shai has a unique opportunity to shape the emperor of this land. And what responsibility does she have with that opportunity to create someone, who would be a good and responsible leader? And can she successfully pull that off given the aesthetic constraints that I've talked about, where, you have to keep things plausible? Is it possible for there to be a leader who is also a good person? Is one of the questions that the story is exploring, I think. And, given the kind of optimism that is inscribed in the Cosmere itself, the answer is yes. We've already seen leaders who are, both effective leaders and good people at the same time. It's rare, but it's completely doable. And I think the core ability that Shai needs in the story to achieve that braiding together of a version of the emperor that could successfully exist, who is also a responsible and effective leader, comes down to empathy. Constantly through the story, she's trying to understand the world through the experience, through the eyes, in the shoes of however you want to say it, of the emperor. To whatever degree, she's trying to make her perspective align with the emperor's perspective successfully. And she kind of sees the way in which his daily life and his privilege and all of the tiny compromises that he has to make along the way shifted him out of his idealism and his desire to make the country a better place for the regular people in the world, to the point where he's just constantly deferring his actions. Like, I'll do it tomorrow, I'll do it tomorrow, I'll do it tomorrow. And he never gets around to doing those important but difficult things that would make his country a better place for the people outside of the palace. And by being able to see how that could happen to a leader without kind of judging him as a bad person, without involving hatred or resentment or contempt, but instead, like I said, an empathy that centers his experience over her judgment of him, she's able to successfully inhabit a version of him that becomes viable magically. And so she's able to incorporate elements of a new personality that will stop deferring those intentions and decisions that will make the kingdom a better place, while retaining all of the other elements of his personality. And then she, makes that into a seal and uses it on him, and he kind of wakes up. He comes back to himself. And so she successfully creates a character, a person. And I think that is, the magic of storytelling for us as readers, right? That we get to encounter these characters who feel authentic and real to us. It feels like we could meet them. It feels like we could have a conversation with them, and they would have answers to questions like, what is your favorite color? That's a question that she asks the emperor over and over to try and test to see, is she getting it right? These are the kind of writing exercises, if you went to a formal university system, that they'll talk about, like, write a letter to your characters and see how they respond to it, or try to think about, what's their favorite entertainment to watch, or things like that. What's their favorite color? What's their favorite food? Because all of those questions kind of humanize the character in a way and get it away from the functionalism of cohering to the, classic plot constructions. You don't want to reduce the characters to machinery, because that's going to grate on the experience of the audience and kind of interrupt that immersion into the story that I was talking about. And so Shai needs to create an emperor who is an immersive experience, in terms of encountering him in the throne room. You're not going to question, like, wait a minute, is that really the emperor? That doesn't seem like the kind of thing that guy would do or say. And instead, she totally recreates him to the point where one of his closest advisors and oldest friends and mentors can't tell the difference between before the assassination and after the assassination, except for the fact that he was involved in recreating the emperor. And so he knows that on a certain level, his soul is a facsimile. And so I think that kind of, that character's experience of what Shai achieves kind of ratifies the art. There's a way in which, she created him. And so she was like, gives herself the validation of like, I did it. I created the masterpiece. But by having an audience, if you will, to experience the art, and someone who has a high level of sophistication when it comes to interacting with that art, in this case, a close personal friend of the emperor, he's able to kind of, give the seal of approval to it and say like, yeah, this is totally 100% successful. And so that's why I say that there are these hard aesthetic limits to art in the Cosmere. I think the story is kind of affirming that there is successful art and unsuccessful art, and that has to do both with following these kind of aesthetic rules, but also the way that the audience encounters it. But also, if we just sink a little bit deeper into the Cosmere itself, I think this is an important idea that we're being introduced to and echoes with other elements that we've already encountered in the Cosmere. The idea that a person could come back from the dead. I mean, we've seen that over and over, right? That in Elantris, to a certain degree, with Raoden and all of the other Elantrians who are dead. And then in Warbreaker, the returned gods, and also Vasher talks about the returned and that kind of thing. And then there are the relationships between, magic and bodies that we talked about in Feruchemy, and the way that, like Sazed's body was able to reshape, or like the Steel Inquisitors, right? Where they literally get nailed through the head, but they're still alive and stuff. And so magic can interact with bodies in a way where it reconfigures the personality, and it can pull the body beyond the normal boundaries of, biological death. And there can be a kind of reinscribing of the person in some way. This is going to be explored a lot more in the larger kind of Cosmere story. And I like the way that the seal kind of physically operates in that way, where she takes the seal and she pushes it into the object or the person, in the case of the emperor, and it kind of sinks into them. And then you get the magical effect coming out of it. Because there's a way in which, that physical body that they were able to repair in the emperor is kind of like a medium in which she is literally able to inscribe a new person. And so she's, the same way that a sculptor uses marble as a medium to create the representation of a person, she's created a person in this physical body who, it's like she had the mold and then she used the body to pour the mold into, And usually you would think of it the other way around, that you would kind of pour the soul into the body, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels like she's, pressing it into him in a real physical way. That part of it really works for me symbolically, I guess. So this is a really complicated, crunchy story with all kinds of layers. I didn't talk anything about, the emotional relationships that emerge through the whole thing, or even Shy's character and her tenacity and brilliance, and the way that she's a cunning trickster, or any of the other implications about the world. I just focused on this, off the top of my head. That's just really hit me this time, how totally postmodern this story is. And because of this kind of Summer of Cosmere project, the way in which it's interacting with that signified and signifier relationship, and how I think it's kind of pointing to the idea of hard aesthetic limits in the Cosmere. That Sanderson is kind of saying something about his beliefs about art and language and the interaction of all of those things, that kind of pushes back against the disposition of our culture to be like, everything's random and meaningless, and there's no basement to the meaning of things, right? He's kind of saying, no, there is. There is a meaning out there. It is discernible, it is findable, and here are some of the ways that you can kind of understand that. So I'm going to move on from this one to another short story that's going to take place on a world that we haven't visited yet at all, where the story is called Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell. So this is like kind of horror story in the Cosmere that is something totally new and different.